Hello everyone, this is Dr. Pruitt. Thank you for joining me today. Today we're going to be discussing human trafficking and the perspective from EMS and emergency response. This is a very heavy topic, but it's also very important because as EMS professionals and emergency medicine professionals, we're at a unique point in engaging with these patients if we can recognize their situation to be able to offer them some help. So the reason this is important is this is one of the biggest issues of our day. More than any other time in history, we know that millions of humans each year are falling prey to trafficking, whether it's through labor or sexual trafficking, more than any other time in history. And the thing that makes this difficult is that it's hidden in plain sight. And so unless we can learn the clues to recognition and how to spot when this is going on and identify these victims, it makes it hard for us to offer help to them. But it is a really big problem. It's the fastest growing business in organized crime in the world. And when you look at annual profits, this is hard to believe, but we're really talking about the sale of humans here for forced labor or forced sexual acts. And when you look at all of the money that ExxonMobil, Apple, Samsung, and Walmart all put together, it still doesn't even equal all the money that is being generated by the sale of humans. And so there's a lot of money to be had, which means there's a lot of associated crime and a lot of associated violence. But this is a really big issue. And when you compare it to other black market economies on the scale of billions of dollars, drugs, of course, when we're talking about black market economies, still make the majority of the profits at around an estimated $300 billion a year. But when you compare the sale of humans, for instance, to the sale of illegal arms or guns, it's just as profitable. And actually, the sale and exploitation of humans is growing at a remarkable pace compared to the sale of guns or drugs. And if you're put yourself in the shoes of the bad guy here for a minute. If you are wanting to make money on the black market, you have an option basically of selling drugs or guns or humans. The unfortunate truth in all of this is, let's say once you sell a gun, that gun is now out of your possession and in the possession of someone else, and that revenue stream is gone. Same with drugs. Those drugs, once you sell them, are out of your possession. They're belonging to someone else, and they are no longer generating revenue for you unless you have a continuous supply. What makes trafficking in humans appealing to these criminals is that once you have a human life in your possession, you can sell them repeatedly and they don't necessarily leave your possession. And so they are a continual revenue source, which makes them a large source of revenue, but is also just diabolical in the way that fellow human beings are being treated. And so when you look at this on a worldwide level, because this is a worldwide problem, it tends to be that in the West, there's more of a predominance of sexual exploitation. This includes minors, includes people of all races, genders, identities, anything you can imagine. But in the West and in Europe, tends to be sexual trafficking. In Africa and Southeast Asia, for instance, it tends to be labor trafficking. So there are two types of trafficking as defined by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. One is sex trafficking, and that's a commercial sex act that is produced by force or fraud or coercion. Those are very important legal terms. And if the person is over the age of 18. For labor trafficking, this is the recruitment or harboring of individuals, again, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion to do things that they would not otherwise do and are not appropriately compensated for it and are basically kept in a situation of servitude or debt bondage, being forced to work when they wouldn't necessarily want to. Different types of labor trafficking, and again, this is across the world. So types of domestic servitude, sometimes we even see it here with caretakers in homes of elderly folks. Factories and sweatshops is really big in Africa and Asia. Construction, this is a big deal in the Middle East. Any type of service industry, also agriculture, and sometimes even door-to-door sales. And then there's sex trafficking. So we all, when we think of this, I think it's easiest and most common to think of typical street prostitution. This is a little bit different than prostitution. Typical prostitution is someone who's made a decision to do that type of business and wage earning on their own. It's different from sex trafficking, where someone else is forcing them to do those acts and then taking the money from them and using force, fraud, and coercion to do so. But definitely street prostitution, there are rings of human trafficking there. Massage parlors are very big here in Albuquerque. It's not uncommon for many of these parlors to be associated with human trafficking rings. Truck stops are also very common. There's big, dark, deep parking lots with big trucks where a lot of movement of humans can occur and no one is really watching, and it's out of sight of video cameras or really police surveillance. One of the biggest ones here in Albuquerque that comes to mind is right by the Big I at Manalapan University. There's a very big truck lot there where a lot of trafficking happens along those big freeway corridors as people are moving in and out of the city. And then online is increasingly probably the most prevalent place where people are being trafficked, and this is different types of escort services. This includes a growing number of these are trafficked on either Facebook or social media platforms where people are looking for different types of escorts or different types of encounters, and people are being sold. And they can meet up in hotels or wherever they meet, and it's not just kind of the seedy hotels that you think of. This can, I just heard a story the other day of an incident that happened in Hotel Chaco. So it sometimes is the nicer hotels as well, but many times people get access to these victims through online and social media platforms. If they're reporting by incident, this is reported from the Polaris Project, which is a national sex trafficking reporting hotline, and they gather data about self-reported incidents of what's happening in the United States. And the majority, as you can see here, of the sex trafficking incidents occur through escort services that are garnished either online, through different dating apps, or through Facebook or social media platforms. And then a large percentage also comes through the form of pornography industry, and then the massage parlors are the next leading. And we have all of that here in Albuquerque, and it's actually very prevalent. And when we think about Albuquerque in particular, we know that nationwide, when there's big events that come to town, a Super Bowl is a famous one, different traffickers will bring more victims into town, knowing that there's going to be a large transient visitor population that are looking to have a good time, maybe more interested in illicit sexual activities. And they actually have these victims on circuits, and they will bus them from town to town every couple of months, depending on which events are going on in town. So we recently just had the State Fair. Another big one here is the Gathering of Nations, where they'll bring in extra victims here for the increased demand during these times. And it's difficult for the victims because they're constantly being moved in groups from city to city, and frequently they don't know what city they're in. By moving them, it also doesn't allow them to make any friends or establish relationships where maybe they could get out of the situation they're in, because they're constantly unaware of where they are. They may not know what city they're in, what day it is, and by keeping them disoriented, the traffickers are able to basically keep them in bondage. And so it's important for us to realize when we have big events that come to town to have a heightened sense of awareness to help identify these victims and help get them the help that they need. But truly, this is happening every day. You don't need the State Fair to be here for this to happen, because we live at a major crossroads in the U.S. with I-25 and the I-40 corridor there at the Big I. This is a major crossroads every day of the week, and it's important for us to recognize this as an everyday problem. So when we look at statistics, it's easy to ask the question, is it mostly males, mostly females? Is it young kids, older adults? What we know, and this again is reported from the Polaris Project, and these are statistics from a couple of years ago, but the majority of reported incidents are adults, but there's a significant number of minors that are involved as well. Not only that, but the majority, at least for sexual trafficking, tend to be female, but there is a large market for both children. I've read reports as young as 4 years old, and then males and gender minorities as well. So it affects every age and race, every creed and color. This affects everyone. So there's no stereotypical person or stereotype to watch out for. You really need to think about this with anyone that you could be encountering on an EMS call. So why do you care? Why are we spending time talking about this? Because we know that 87% of victims report that they've had some sort of interface with healthcare professionals in the last couple of years. And this gives us a huge opportunity. If we can identify them and offer them help, it's a chance to help them get free. And so we are the front lines of this, whether we see it or not, and it's important for us to know what to look for. So the eye doesn't see what the mind does not know. So unless we talk about red flags or things to look for in patient presentation or patient history, we're not going to be able to identify these folks. And so the next little bit of this is going to be talking about the situation that they're in, how to approach them, and how to identify these victims. So before we talk about victims, let's talk about traffickers. These are definitely wolves in sheep's clothing. They can be incredibly charming, incredibly resourceful, believable. They are very good at gaining trust, finding usually a very vulnerable population, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But they can play on people's vulnerabilities very well and manipulate those to their advantage. And so if they find someone who is feeling alone or ignored, they may make them feel very loved and appreciated and cared for, promise them a better life, promise them a career, glamour, love, whatever that void that they're able to identify in that victim, they find a way to make promises to fulfill that void and pull them away from the situation that they're in to get them into this trafficking situation. And they could be groomed over months developing these relationships. And so trafficker tactics can vary depending on what they think the victim is going to respond to. So sometimes they'll start out very friendly. They'll act as a rescuer or a friend. I had a situation in the pediatric ER maybe about a year ago now where there was a 10-year-old transgender child who was being bullied at school, had some familial trauma recently, just in a really dark place, feeling very depressed and alone and outcast. And this child's outlet was to play video games. And someone online that he had been playing video games with from Florida, like a 40-year-old male, had been grooming him for months to help him determine a way to run away from home and meet him in a park somewhere and then run away together. And this child was definitely getting ready to be kidnapped. Luckily, the mom had intervened and the child ended up being safe. But the situations like this happen every day. And social media and gaming is a big way that especially children get recruited. And these predators are out there just waiting for children that feel alone and unloved and make promises of a much better life that they fall prey to. And sometimes that involves gifts or compliments. And not all traffickers try the friendly techniques. Some of them are actually overtly a little bit more stern, and that can involve abduction or kidnapping. Lots of times they'll use threats or intimidation. And it's not uncommon for the traffickers to get the victims addicted to drugs. The benefit for them about getting people addicted is that, as we know, drugs are very addictive and people need their fix. And if these victims are only able to get their drugs through the trafficker, it makes them more dependent on the trafficker. So not infrequently is there substance use disorder involved in these situations. And it's all in an effort to make the victim more dependent on the trafficker for everything in life. They get very controlling when they eat, when they go to the bathroom, what they do, how they spend their time, how they spend their money, everything. And so they tend to target people that are vulnerable. So runaways and foster children are probably some of the prime targets. So if you find yourself on a scene with patients who are in the foster care system or part of the juvenile justice system, recognize that they're at incredibly high risk. There are people out there that are looking to suck them up and bring them into the fold, make promises to them, but then also exploit them. And so take advantage of opportunities to intervene with these kids before they end up in a worse situation. Any homeless kids, a lot of times these days, we had a recent situation with an immigrant, as you can imagine, as they come across the border into a new country, don't know the culture, don't speak the language, looking for somewhere to go, somewhere safe to be. If these traffickers meet them at the border and offer them, a friendly face, a warm meal, a place to go, that's very enticing if you've just hiked for months to get into the United States and you think it's all going to be safe and you trust these people. And then pretty quickly they can turn and take advantage of these immigrants and either put them into forced labor or use the sex trafficking and get them into the circuit there. Recruiting also happens in prisons. And then we also know that social minorities are at higher risk of being targets as well. So things, particularly with youth, because there is a large amount of youth involvement in the sex trafficking industry, we call these the ACEs, adverse childhood events. And they're things that unfortunately happen in some children's lives that have been studied over time, and we know actually it leads to adverse health outcomes, adverse behavioral health outcomes, but it also puts them at higher risk for this type of trafficking. So any sort of child welfare involvement, history of abuse or neglect, drug-addicted parent, juvenile justice system involvement, or gang membership in particular, these kids are very vulnerable. You can imagine if they've come from an unstable home situation, they're maybe hungry for love, hungry for a family that will take care of them, hungry for some sort of stability in their life. And if this trafficker is as charming as they can be, maybe they can fall prey to the lies that they're told by trafficking and find themselves in this situation. There's things that push people into trafficking. So like we mentioned, maybe an immigrant family where they're in a new country and the trafficker's telling them that for the benefit of their family back home, they have to do what they're told or they'll kill their family. They may do this because they're incredibly impoverished and they're hungry and they feel like they have to do something just to stay alive. Maybe they're trying to escape an even worse situation at home. Sometimes they're just vulnerable and want a need to belong or to be loved. And then there's things that pull people into this lifestyle. So it's really just the lies, the glamour, the anonymity, maybe the false promises, the deception, things that they're hungry to hear and are hopeful that will happen. They fall prey to those lies, and then before they know it, they're stuck in this situation. And so just realize these people at some point to get into this situation have had an extreme violation of their trust. So at some point they believed somebody to give them this better life or to take care of them or whatever. And then they found themselves in this situation where either they're forced into doing something they don't want to do, whether it be sexual acts, whether it be drug use, whatever the case may be, or they've been deceived and then it becomes clear that they were deceived with false offers of employment or education, or they're coerced into doing something they don't want to do. All of these things lead to a victim that it forever is going to be very hard to gain their trust again because they've been so violated. And so we need to realize that when we think we may be interacting with one of these victims on scene, just realize it's going to be more difficult than normal to gain their trust, and that's okay. That's their reaction to their circumstances that they're in. And it is even, they raise up barriers because there are still more lies that they believe, and so they really don't want to be identified very frequently. So there's barriers to even identifying people who are being trafficked. A lot of times they're isolated from other people. They may not have friends. They are constantly feeling monitored. They will likely appear very anxious on scene, constantly like looking around to see who's watching. You may find yourself in a hotel room. I was talking to a detective about this the other day. Not infrequently, if you are on a call, like in a hotel room or somewhere where the trafficking is occurring, there may be video cameras everywhere. And we're not just talking like a security camera at the door. We're talking about cameras everywhere where this person is under constant surveillance. Never a free moment, can never say anything in private. Those kind of things are big red flags. If there's an abnormal attachment to someone who doesn't appear to be a family member, so like a controlling other party who's there dictating the history or speaking for the patient, that's another red flag. And a lot of times, if you have a patient with a language barrier that's clearly an immigrant, new to the culture, that just seems lost, doesn't know where they are, unable to communicate, afraid to communicate, and then really acting mistrusting, those are all red flags that this person may be being trafficked. And a lot of times they have trouble mistrusting authorities because they've been told, you've done all these drugs, you've done all these terrible things, prostitution is illegal, you're here illegally, they're going to send you back. And so sometimes they're more afraid of law enforcement than they are of the actual trafficker, because it's more of the unknown, and they are ashamed of what's happened, and they don't want to get caught for maybe the things they've been forced to do. They didn't even do willingly, but they're still afraid that law enforcement is not going to be an ally in this, and they may end up in worse trouble than they're currently in. And so typically the scenes where I think that we'd be most likely to encounter these victims of human trafficking in an emergency setting would be things like assault calls, where you may see a trafficker abusing a victim. And sometimes if this happens in public, it may be a bystander that calls. And so it's important to have a heightened sense of awareness when we're going to these apparent domestic violence incidents. Sometimes there's mental health issues. We know that substance abuse can be a big piece of this. Also, frequently, females can call for either pelvic pain or abdominal pain or sepsis. Frequently, these patients will end up with sexually transmitted infections, ectopic pregnancies, trauma, and or needing prenatal care. And so OB, GYN complaints are very common too, so I'd have a heightened sense of alertness on those calls when you're taking that history. And then, of course, for the labor trafficking, if there's workplace injuries, examine the workplace environment, see if you think it's safe, what they're doing. You can ask questions about, to help just clarify what they know about their work and why they're there and what they're doing. There's also mental health indicators. As you can imagine, this is an incredibly awful situation to be in, and so it's not uncommon for them to feel anxious or depressed, to feel shame and guilt about the situations that they've been placed in. Frequently, suicidal ideation is not uncommon. They're in a terrible situation and feel hopeless and helpless to get out of it. And as opposed to that, sometimes folks just kind of shut down emotionally and seem to have a lack of emotional responsiveness or PTSD. So it's important as we approach these patients and we start to recognize what to identify, that we understand their mindset. So they frequently do feel helpless and hopeless and beyond any help. They're going to be mistrusting of anyone they haven't met before because they've been deceived gravely before. And so they feel very isolated, disoriented, conflicting in who they can trust, who they can't. Sometimes if they know they're a trafficker, they may believe what they say still about law enforcement or about healthcare, and feel, even though they're being treated terribly, may feel more comfortable with that trafficker and less inclined to get the help that they need. So, and especially if they're immigrants, they're not going to be that familiar with the culture or understand where they can get help or how they can get help. And so it's a very helpless, hopeless feeling. So things that we can look for, clues, I mentioned a couple of these before, but you may see excessive amounts of cash on a scene. Multiple hotel room keys is another indicator. Maybe, like I mentioned, the cameras everywhere, constant surveillance. You remember that we talked about the money that these people bring in. This is their revenue. So just like a drug dealer takes good care of his drugs because that's the revenue stream, these traffickers are going to know where their victims are and how they're behaving because that's their revenue stream. And so there's going to be surveillance everywhere. You may see excessive like sexual paraphernalia, a whole lot of lube. I heard a story recently about someone in a hotel where they had found like a whole trash can full of used condoms in a room. And so excessive paraphernalia could be a clue to this going on. Also a victim that doesn't make eye contact. So eye contact is a really big form of communication in this community, and by not making eye contact, it conveys submissiveness. And you may find that the victim is not willing to make eye contact with you, and that's the way they've been trained. But that's a clue that something is going on. And you can ask about their knowledge of their current situation if they know what hotel they're in, what city they're in, what day it is. All of those things, if they don't have answers to those questions, those are other clues that they may be being deceived on purpose. So when you're trying to obtain your patient history, many times the history may not make sense or not completely add up. You may find a very controlling person on scene who wants to provide that history for you and answer their questions. In this situation, it's always wise to try to separate, if you can, get that patient into the ambulance where you can have a private interview and get them away from that controlling individual. If they are acting fearful or nervous, don't just chalk it up to just general anxiety. Ask them why. We had a very astute provider recently who had an anxious young lady in the back of the ambulance, and instead of just chalking it up to anxiety, asked her what was wrong. And she was able to divulge that she was being trafficked and that her son was in danger. And because of him taking the extra minute to kind of dig into her anxiety a little bit more, was able to make a really big difference in her life. And so it's important to dig a little deeper with our patients, especially the ones that are anxious or acting very fearful, and see how we can help. Sometimes you may see physical manifestations, so tattoos or branding is very common, and it would be, typically it's on the neck or near the genitalia where you would kind of expect someone to put their brand, essentially. It may have a person's name, it may have a certain symbol. There's not one in particular that you can watch out for, but you can ask about people's tattoos and what they mean. Frequently, these victims are malnourished. Food is used as a reward or as a punishment, and so they may be ravenously hungry if they've recently been misbehaving, and they may look malnourished. Teeth is another one. Typically, these folks don't get routine health care, so poor dentition, poor physical appearance. But not always poor physical appearance. Sometimes the traffickers will pay a lot of money to keep them looking nice, nails done, hair done, things like that, so that they can make more money. But they do frequently suffer abuse at the hands of the traffickers, and so bruising patterns that would be consistent with assault, bruising on the upper arms, on the thighs, on the stomach or the back or the neck, sometimes fractures that haven't healed completely. And very commonly, one of the most frequent interactions with EMS and with the hospital is for reproductive issues. So whether that's pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, pelvic pain, fever, genital trauma, all of those can generate calls as well. So have a heightened degree of suspicion on those interactions. Now, a lot of times these patients are not going to want to come right out and tell you that they're being trafficked. A lot of times they don't even understand that they're being trafficked. This is just a situation that they're in. And they're not going to want to talk about it because they're going to be ashamed of the situations that they've been in. They're going to be very fearful of their trafficker. They don't want to get arrested or deported. And they may not know what's out there to help them. So the best thing that you can do is, one, recognize the red flags and get them to a safe environment. Do your best to separate them from the controlling individual who's there. Let them know that anything they say is confidential and you're going to respect their wishes. You can listen, ask those questions we talked about, convey your concern and your care for them. If you can, use interpreters. And importantly, don't make promises that you can't fulfill, but offer to get them somewhere safe. And so in our situation, the safest place we can get them is to the hospital. So I'd encourage them to go to the hospital where there's more resources and more time to help act on their behalf. Important things you can ask to help figure out the situation that they're in is, who are you living with? Who do you live with? Can you come and go as you please? Can you use the bathroom when you want to? Can you eat when you want to? Is someone forcing you to do things you don't want to do? Is anyone threatening you or your family? All of those things are simple yes/no questions that may lead them to being more willing to talk to you once you've established some rapport in a private place. And then if they do say yes to any of those questions, and identify that they're in a dangerous situation, first acknowledge that it's a dangerous situation and you want to get them help and you don't want this to happen to anybody else. Make sure they understand that their safety is your first priority. And then really, truly try to convince them to go to the hospital. That's going to be the best bet to get them resources, get them help, and get them onto a safer path. Now, this is another key point here. If they do not want law enforcement involved, do not call law enforcement. There are nonprofit organizations that are able to interact on these patients' behalf without calling law enforcement. Many times if we do have the police there, they're under constant surveillance. So if the cartel or the traffickers are watching, they may truly really harm the family member or whoever they're holding hostage or whatever they're holding over that victim's head. Bad things can happen. And so defer to your patient if you want law enforcement to be involved or not. Our only job is to take care of that patient, respect their wishes, and get them to the hospital. And then once they do decide to go to the hospital, and hopefully they do, our biggest resource here in Albuquerque is the Rape Crisis Center of New Mexico. They have a 24-hour hotline, speaks both Spanish and English. This is a wonderful resource. We recently had a case where a trafficking victim was identified by EMS, and we were able to call the Rape Crisis Center, and they had a victim advocate at the hospital within 30 minutes who spoke Spanish, who brought her a care package, and was able to get her the care that she needed and talk her through the process of basically being rescued and pulled out of the situation that she was in, and got her the help that she needed. And so partner with the patient, whether or not they want to involve law enforcement. That's not our decision. Our biggest decision is just to get them to the hospital. And then make sure the hospital knows about your concerns. Explain what you saw, what the patient told you, what they thought. And then you can start the ball rolling by calling the Rape Crisis Center. And then if this ever does come to a court case, which a lot of times, unfortunately, they don't, but just in case, as always, you want to make sure your documentation is really squared away to explain the situation and what you saw and what you heard and what the patient said, so that if we ever do get to testify against the bad guys, that testimony is ready to go. And that is all I have for you. I hope that this helped just review the signs of things that you can look for these trafficking victims, and now you feel a little bit more prepared on what to look for, what to ask, and how to help.